Can you believe that the people who claimed to have turned their backs on the world were secretly the ones holding the very strings of England's destiny, controlling more wealth, more land, and more political leverage than the king himself dared to admit? This wasn't just faith. This was a shadow empire built on silence and stone, a catastrophe no one saw coming until it was too late to escape its grip. For centuries, as the brutal, muddy reality of medieval Britain unfolded, a world defined by famine, war, and the terrifying omnipresence of death, there stood colossal, unmoving monuments of granite and awe. These were the abbeys, the priories, the spiritual fortresses where men dedicated themselves to God, or so the story goes. But peel back the layers of piety, scrape away the carefully constructed facade of humility, and what you find is not sanctity, but staggering, unimaginable power. Imagine 12th century England. The air is thick with the stench of wood smoke and unwashed humanity. Yet, miles from the chaos, deep in the isolated valleys, the monks were not just praying. They were operating a vast, sophisticated, international business model that made the king's treasury look like pocket change. They were the world's first true multinational corporations, trading wool across Europe, financing wars, and holding the literal deeds to over a third of the entire arable land in the realm. These men, shrouded in the coarse black or white wool of their respective orders, the established, powerful Benedictines, and the relentlessly driven expansionist Cistercians, had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These were the promises that bound them, yet simultaneously, these very vows granted them immunity and authority that no secular lord could ever dream of wielding. They were untouchable, accountable only to Rome, a foreign power thousands of miles away, and to a God who remained silent behind the echoing walls of the chapter house. We are not talking about a few humble men tending gardens. We are talking about complexes so immense they dwarfed entire towns. Fountains Abbey, Reval, St. Albans, these were not mere churches, they were industrial hubs, libraries preserving the entirety of human knowledge, hospitals treating thousands, and most importantly, giant humming engines of medieval finance. Their sheer ambition was terrifying. Think about the entry. A wealthy young son, perhaps the fourth or fifth born, with no hope of inheritance, is led through the massive oak doors. He leaves his name, his possessions, and his identity behind. He takes the cowl, believing he is exchanging the dangers of the world for the safety of the eternal. What he doesn't realize is that he is stepping into a different kind of danger, one defined by the crushing weight of ritual, the tyranny of the bell, and the cold, terrifying secrets buried beneath the altar stones. The silence inside these walls was not peaceful. It was oppressive. It was a tool of control. From the moment the novice woke, long before the first glimmer of dawn broke over the frost-covered cloister, until he collapsed exhausted onto his thin pallet hours after Compline. His life was meticulously scheduled, broken only by the incessant, demanding sequence of the 7 canonical hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Every 3 hours, the bell screamed its command, reminding him that his body was no longer his own. And the cold. Imagine the relentless, marrow-deep chill of a stone monastery in the heart of a British winter, the ink freezing in the scriptorium, the only heat coming from the flickering lamp near the reading desk. They were enduring physical hardship that would break the strongest knight, all while committing vast libraries of Latin texts to memory. This discipline was the key to their power. It was the training ground for the ultimate administrators, the calculating minds that managed the sheep flocks, numbering in the tens of thousands, stretching across entire counties. But where there is such extreme wealth and such enforced silence, corruption is inevitable. The vows were meant to be iron chains holding human nature at bay, but often they became flimsy silk scarves, easily discarded in the darkness of the dormitory or the privacy of the abbot's opulent chambers. The same structure designed to promote holiness was in reality a breeding ground for scandal, avarice, and often outright defiance of every moral law they claimed to uphold. The abbot, who was supposed to be the humble shepherd of the flock, was often a figure of terrifying secular authority, riding out with armed retinues, dining on extravagant dishes forbidden to his brothers, and negotiating treaties with barons. These were princes of the church, feared by the peasantry and respected by the nobility. They held the power of excommunication, the threat of eternal damnation, and the keys to the most sophisticated financial networks in Europe. This is the true story of medieval monastic life, not a tale of simple devotion, but an epic of ambition, extreme wealth hidden beneath sackcloth, and a political machine so perfectly constructed that when the forces of history eventually turned against it centuries later, the resulting collapse shook the foundation of England to its very core. We must understand the breathtaking magnitude of their rule before we can grasp the devastating chaos of their fall.
Get ready, because we are descending into the cloistered world of the 12th to 14th centuries, where prayer masked prophet and silence hid secrets that could buy and sell kingdoms. The greatest secret of medieval England wasn't hidden in a dungeon. It was hidden in plain sight, chanted daily in Gregorian tones, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the greatest buildings ever erected on the island. Prepare for the journey into the shadow kingdom of the monks.
The moment we step through the massive bronze-clad doors of Fountains Abbey, the air changes. You are no longer in the King's England. You are in the Pope's England, ruled by men who swore off earthly things, but controlled more actual land than any baron in the realm. This shadow kingdom wasn't built on faith alone. It was constructed upon acres, vast sprawling tracts of the finest agricultural land in Britain, gifted over centuries by fearful nobles seeking salvation, or cynical kings buying temporary loyalty and influence. Imagine a modern corporation today buying up 30% of Manhattan. The scale of control is comparable. That's the overwhelming scale we are talking about. By the 13th century, a single major Benedictine house could own dozens of manors, controlling thousands of tenants who lived and died solely to fund the perpetual chant and the increasingly luxurious existence of the spiritual elite. These properties were not just quaint farms run by simple monks. They were highly efficient, ruthlessly managed industrial complexes known throughout the land as granges. The grange was the beating, logistical heart of the monastery's economy, managed not by praying choir monks, but by savvy lay brothers, the conversi, who were often exempt from the strict spiritual obligations of the cloister. They were not spending their days in silent contemplation. They were calculating yields, managing complex labor disputes, and tracking vast inventories with the cold, efficient ruthlessness of a modern CEO. Forget the romantic image of a simple, dusty monk tilling a small personal patch of vegetables. These men were overseeing entire ecosystems of production, manipulating commodity markets, and setting prices before modern economics was even formally invented. Their financial sophistication put the king's treasury to shame, operating with a centralized bureaucracy that monarchs could only dream of achieving. But the true, unholy secret to their colossal power didn't lie merely in growing wheat or brewing the best ale, though they excelled at both. The ultimate source of their global, devastating wealth lay in the fleece, the humble, shimmering coat of the English sheep. This unassuming product was, in the medieval world, the equivalent of crude oil, and a specific order, the famed Cistercian white monks, held the absolute international monopoly. The Cistercians, ironically, were founded on the strictest interpretation of poverty, intentionally retreating to the wildest, most desolate lands of Yorkshire and the Welsh marches to escape the worldly contamination that had already infected the older Benedictine houses. What those desolate, wind-swept uplands were perfect for, however, was grazing millions upon millions of the finest, most sought-after wool-producing sheep in all of Europe. They were the undisputed industrial giants of the 13th century, perfecting sheep husbandry and, crucially, establishing direct, sophisticated trade links to the booming, cash-rich textile centers of Flanders and Italy. Their agents were international businessmen, traveling under the guise of religious duty, carrying not scriptures, but detailed ledgers and complex bills of exchange that bypassed local taxes and tariffs entirely. While the king struggled constantly to gather fragmented taxes from recalcitrant barons, the Cistercians were moving colossal, highly valuable bales of raw fiber across the Channel, using their papal protections to operate above the local law and government scrutiny. They were the medieval world's first successful multinational corporation, their silent vows masking a roaring engine of global commerce. The abbot of a great house, like Glastonbury, St. Albans, or Bury St. Edmunds, was therefore not merely a spiritual guide or a humble shepherd of souls. He was a political prince, an international banker, and a major foreign policy player in his own right. He sat in Parliament, often holding more political sway than half the barons combined, controlling massive reserves of liquid capital that the king himself frequently had to borrow just to fund his necessary wars or pay off pressing national debts. Imagine the sheer, terrifying power wielded by the abbot when the King of England owes him a debt that rivals the size of the national treasury. Their political leverage was effectively absolute, protected by centuries of tradition, immense landholdings, and the specific immunity granted by papal bulls, making them seemingly untouchable by any secular local law. They literally operated under a higher, sovereign authority that could not be challenged by mere English law. And this incredible wealth flowed in a constant, silent, uninterrupted stream, funding not just spiritual endeavors, like the care of the poor and the copying of texts, but spectacular, defiant displays of earthly glory, cathedrals that dwarfed any secular palace, illuminated manuscripts bound in beaten gold and jewels, and private dining halls filled with food that would shame the Duke of Lancaster. The sacred vow of poverty taken by the individual monk was merely a decorative curtain drawn over a treasure vault that housed the nation's true economic heart. The foundation document of most English monasticism, the rigorous rule of Saint Benedict, demanded relentless austerity, perpetual silence, a severely simple diet, unending manual labor, and minimal, broken sleep. And for the vast majority of the choir monks and the lay brothers, that grinding, demanding reality was tragically true, lived under the stern, unblinking eye of the prior. They were the engine room, fueled by prayer and hardship. But the higher you climbed that ecclesiastical ladder, the lighter the chains of abstinence miraculously became. The abbot's lodging was rarely just a cell. It was often a private palace built adjacent to the cloister, frequently boasting its own kitchens, private stables, and even exclusive hunting reserves for recreation. While the common monks ate cold communal pottage, the abbot enjoyed fine imported wines, rare spices, and succulent roasted game served meticulously on expensive silver plate, often entertaining powerful guests. This wasn't merely simple hypocrisy. It was the sophisticated, necessary mechanism of a tiered hierarchy of luxury, disguised carefully as holiness. The political power brokers lived like landed kings, while the foot soldiers of the faith bore the true burden, ensuring the terrifying engine of the shadow empire never, ever stalled. But with such colossal, centralized wealth came an equally colossal danger, and the constant threat of confiscation or theft. These were not just holy men. They were guarding vast quantities of gold, silver, irreplaceable legal charters, and the deepest political secrets of the realm. The monastery walls were not simply spiritual barriers against the corrupt secular world. They were massive stone fortresses designed to keep enemies out, and sometimes, tragically, to keep the dark, illegal deeds inside, hidden from God's immediate sight. The next terrifying revelation will peel back the thin spiritual layer and expose the ruthless, often violent methods used by these supposed men of God to protect their massive wealth, and the silent, deadly espionage that made the monasteries the most feared intelligence and political network in all of medieval Britain. Stay tuned, because the supposed silence of the cloister is about to be violently shattered by the unmistakable sound of steel and the desperate whisper of conspiracy. The whispered conspiracy that haunted the previous segment was not about outside forces seeking to breach the sacred walls. It was a civil war fought entirely within the confines of the chapter house itself. A brutal, relentless battle for absolute control of unimaginable wealth and political leverage. The abbot, the supposed spiritual shepherd, was in reality the CEO of a multinational corporation, a feudal lord commanding armies of tenants and controlling resources that dwarfed many actual kingdoms and provided the financial bedrock for the entire English economy. His election was not a quiet spiritual consensus guided by divine light, but a brutal, high-stakes political campaign involving massive bribes, intense lobbying of the papacy in Rome, and sometimes literal violence that stained the ancient stone floors with the forbidden blood of brothers. The power held by these men was terrifying in its scope and almost limitless in its application. Imagine the stakes. The abbot of St. Albans or the even richer abbot of Glastonbury controlled vast swaths of England, roads, markets, entire urban centers, and crucially, the judiciary that held sway over thousands of souls. This was localized power that bypassed the authority of the local baron and often challenged the dictates of the king himself, making the abbot an untouchable sovereign within his own colossal domain. When the old abbot died, or, more frequently, was finally forced out by internal maneuvering, political pressure, or simply the relentless strain of administering such an empire, the entire operation shuddered to a halt, waiting for the smoke to clear and reveal the new master of finance and faith. The selection process was a terrifying display of medieval democracy corrupted by pure avarice. Every monk, bound by the solemn vow of poverty, suddenly held a vote worth a staggering fortune in patronage, lucrative appointments, and personal advancement. The candidates for the highest office, often men of the most ruthless ambition rather than the purest piety, would spend years building alliances and gathering favors, promising control over specific lucrative manors, or appointing key supporters to administrative roles that guaranteed private wealth. The papacy, always watching, often inserted itself into these elections, demanding enormous fees to confirm the chosen candidate, transforming the spiritual appointment into a massive international financial transaction. The sheer size and complexity of the operation demanded skills utterly forbidden by the rule of Saint Benedict, rendering the original ascetic intent nothing more than a historical footnote. These weren't men focused solely on contemplation and the salvation of their souls. They were highly skilled bankers, ruthless lawyers, master accountants, and international trade negotiators running the largest logistical machine in the British Isles. The cellarer, the monk theoretically in charge of daily provisions, was actually running the monastery's entire real estate portfolio, managing tens of thousands of acres of prime agricultural land and tracking the yield of hundreds of individual manors scattered across 5 or 6 counties. His ledger book, often bound in fine leather and secured with iron clasps, was thicker and more complex than the royal treasury's own disorganized accounts, detailing sophisticated investments in mills, fisheries, lead mines, and the critically vital, fiercely guarded network of the English wool trade that funded half of continental Europe. This constant pressure to maximize profit and manage political risk inevitably led to the catastrophic shattering of the vows of austerity and isolation. While the average peasant starved outside the high stone gates, the monastic diet inside was often staggering in its richness, a parade of roasted game, expensive imported wine from Bordeaux, and exotic spices few actual nobles could afford daily. Historians reviewing the kitchen accounts have discovered records detailing consumption levels of meat, butter, and alcohol that would make a modern banquet look like a meager, penitent picnic. These were not poor, self-denying hermits. They were powerful, sophisticated Epicureans, hiding immense temporal authority behind a coarse woolen habit. This shocking concentration of wealth and political influence required constant, active protection, and that meant the monks had to look outside their hallowed walls, forging dark, pragmatic alliances with the very men they pretended to transcend, the powerful, often violent local magnates or barons who were always hungry. The massive, virtually tax-exempt landholdings made the monasteries irresistible targets for greedy barons who saw the cloister walls not as sacred, untouchable barriers, but as high fences guarding a staggering, liquid treasure. The barons frequently tried to install their own relatives as compliant abbots, or worse, outright seize monastic lands through legal trickery, or simply by marching their armed retinues onto the contested property under cover of night and seizing the harvests. This meant that the Cistercians and Benedictines, those supposedly silent servants of God, were constantly engaged in grueling legal warfare in the royal courts, hiring the most ruthless lawyers money could buy, maintaining private garrisons of paid mercenaries, and sometimes even fielding small armies of their own armed retainers, trained specifically to defend the monastery's boundaries. The supposed sanctuary was in grim reality a meticulously organized fortress. Beneath the gentle stone archways of the cloister and next to the serene library, armories were maintained, packed with steel helmets, razor-sharp crossbows, and formidable pikes, ready to defend the sacred treasure rooms that held not dusty relics, but vast piles of silver coin, sophisticated instruments of debt, and deeds to half a county's worth of property. The monks themselves, sworn to never shed blood, found themselves organizing the defense, instructing their lay brothers and hired muscle on exactly how to repel a siege led by a rival baron demanding control over a key market town the monastery owned outright. The silence was violently shattered, not by the pious sounds of the divine office, but by the relentless, moral-crushing grind of political survival, where the only true prayer was the one that delivered victory in court, or repelled the armed men at the gates. But the local barons were merely the hungry wolves circling the massive flock. The true predator, the formidable lion watching from the high ground with intense interest, was the King of England himself, perpetually bankrupt and desperately eyeing the astonishing, untouched financial reserves locked behind those thick, sanctified walls. The crown knew exactly how rich the church was, and every new conflict, every whiff of scandal, every proven instance of corruption provided the perfect, indispensable opportunity for the king to demand a crippling gift, a loan, or a tax that could single-handedly fund a war across the Channel in France. This constant, grinding pressure from both barons and the crown created a perpetual climate of paranoid secrecy and deep-seated conspiracy that defined monastic life more than the rule of Saint Benedict ever did. The only thing more dangerous than being poor and powerless in medieval England was being visibly, astronomically wealthy and entirely defenseless, or so the world thought. Stay with us as we uncover the true nature of the king's hungry gaze and the desperate, morally compromising measures the monks took to keep their shadow empire intact, even if it meant betraying their deepest spiritual vows and funding the very wars that destroyed the lives of their tenants. The whispered truth behind the high stone walls, the confession the abbots dared not make in their gilded chapels, was that the true deity they served was not Christ, but the golden fleece itself. This was the engine of their shadow empire, the white gold that flowed from the backs of 10 million sheep and filled the monastic coffers until the sheer weight of the silver threatened to crack the very foundations of the abbey. The Cistercian order, the supposed strictest observers of Benedictine rule, the white monks who vowed simplicity, were the ruthless architects of this economic revolution. They didn't just own fragmented parcels of land, they effectively owned entire counties, vast tracts of desolate moorland and rolling Yorkshire hills, perfectly suited for the production of the finest, most sought-after wool in all of Europe. It wasn't enough to raise the sheep. They had to systematically monopolize and militarize the market, eliminating all competition through a terrifying blend of religious authority and commercial ruthlessness that secular merchants could only dream of possessing. They were not shepherds. They were commodity tyrants draped in white robes. Imagine an ancient, silent Wall Street, run entirely by men who had taken a public vow of absolute poverty. Their massive farms, or granges, were far from quaint little fields tended by gentle hands. They were industrialized, factory-scale operations managed by thousands of lay brothers, the conversi, men who were essentially highly skilled, unpaid laborers, locked into a lifetime contract of silence and submission. These conversi were the forgotten, disciplined workforce of the monastic economy, handling everything from the synchronized shearing of massive flocks to sorting the grades of fleece with a terrifying monastic efficiency that put secular wool merchants to shame. Their silence and discipline were terrifyingly productive, masking the scale of the operation. While the choir monks debated theological minutiae in the warmth of the scriptorium, the conversi were out in the howling wind, driving the economic engine that financed the dizzying construction of soaring Gothic cathedrals, bought royal pardons for their financial indiscretions, and most critically, paid off the international debt incurred by the English crown. The wool they produced was not sold locally. That was beneath them. It was bundled, weighed in thousands of sacks, and shipped directly to the booming textile centers of Flanders and Italy, specifically the hungry looms of Florence and Bruges. This required sophisticated credit systems and massive forward contracts, often negotiated 2 or 3 years in advance of the shearing season. An abbot from Fountains or Rievaulx was thus not just a spiritual leader administering sacraments. He was a powerful CEO negotiating high finance with cold-eyed Venetian bankers and powerful Florentine guilds, speaking in complex terms of exchange rates, insurance risks, and commodity guarantees that would utterly baffle an English baron. He was guaranteeing the delivery of thousands of sacks of supersort wool against astronomical sums of borrowed ready money. The risk inherent in this high-stakes game was astronomical. If the wool harvest failed due to harsh winter, if disease swept through the enormous flock, or if French pirates intercepted the cargo ship crossing the channel, the monastery faced financial ruin and disgrace, a default on the global stage. This constant, grinding financial pressure meant the monastic financiers had to relentlessly cut corners, manipulate prices, secure exclusive transport rights, and ruthlessly exploit their own tenant farmers and the smaller independent wool producers who couldn't possibly compete with their industrial scale and zero labor costs. The crown soon became intimately aware that the monks were the only reliable source of immediate, immense liquid wealth in the entire kingdom, cash reserves that dwarfed the combined treasuries of the secular nobility. When a king needed to launch an expensive campaign in France or pay off a huge war indemnity, where did he turn? Not to the slow-moving feudal lords, but straight to the swift, cash-rich abbeys. The monks became the king's indispensable bankers, but this partnership was a poisoned chalice that corroded their spiritual integrity from the inside out. The king would often demand loans that were never intended to be repaid, or worse, impose massive, arbitrary wool taxes, forcing the monasteries to hand over their entire annual yield at below-market rates to fund his costly foreign adventures. This created a chilling, inescapable cycle of dependency that dragged the sacred institutions into the absolute muck of political corruption. The monks desperately needed the king's temporal protection to enforce their land enclosures, secure their international contracts, and maintain their vast network. And the king needed the monks' financial leverage to wage his endless wars. This was a terrible Faustian pact. They were simultaneously preaching the virtues of extreme asceticism, while funding the murder and destruction of foreign lands and the exploitation of their own workforce, all for the singular purpose of protecting their international wool routes and securing preferential tax exemptions. And what happened when a rival merchant tried to cut into their monopoly? Or when a local peasant dared to complain about the monastic enclosures that stole common grazing land essential for his survival? The terrifying power of the abbey extended far beyond the simple cloister walls. They controlled the local courts, influenced the sheriffs through intimidation and bribery, and held the undeniable keys to the spiritual and temporal fate of every single soul in the county. Dissent was swiftly and brutally crushed, often under the chilling guise of spiritual misconduct, heresy, or simple criminal trespass. The abbot's powerful whispered word was absolute law, backed by the terrifying threat of excommunication for the soul and temporal punishment for the body. Their immense wealth bought them absolute immunity, turning them into virtually untouchable regional despots, veiled entirely in the deceptive cloak of piety and prayer. The quiet, rhythmic hum of the Cistercian spinning wheel was the actual sound of money being printed, the true, hidden soundtrack of medieval England's power structure, far louder than the chanting in the choir. Every single stitch of rich cloth worn by a Flemish nobleman, every gilded chalice bought for the high altar, every strategic, life-saving loan made to a bankrupt king, it all smelled faintly, irrevocably, of sheep and the unspoken, fundamental betrayal of Saint Benedict's simple, humble rule. The monks were no longer spiritual guides. They were the world's most successful and most breathtakingly hypocritical international capitalists. They had mastered the cold art of leveraging God's name for massive global profit, creating an economic system so vast, so deeply entrenched, and so intrinsically interconnected that when the inevitable reckoning finally came, the collapse wouldn't just affect the church, it would shatter the economic spine of the entire British Isle. The golden fleece had become a golden anchor, dragging the whole country down into a deep sea of moral and financial debt. The golden anchor had dropped, and the tidal wave of debt was crashing down not just on the monks, but on the very crown of England. When the Cistercian order, those humble, white-robed shepherds, began defaulting on colossal loans taken from the ruthless banking families of Lombardy and Florence, loans secured against the nation's entire yield of prime wool, the king himself felt the tremor beneath his throne. This was not a sacred pledge. This was high-stakes international finance being run out of a secluded abbey kitchen, and the collateral was the solvency of the realm. The abbot, who swore allegiance only to God, was suddenly more powerful and certainly more indebted than many minor European princes. He held the golden thread, and if he sneezed, the entire wool market collapsed, leaving the English treasury scrambling to cover the sacred deficit, while desperately trying to keep the international creditors from seizing royal assets. But who, truly, was paying the immediate, brutal price for this colossal, cloistered greed? Not the choir monks, warming their hands by the chapter house fire, debating the finer points of Augustine, or sipping their excellent imported wine. No, the overwhelming burden fell upon the conversi, the lay brothers. These were the forgotten workforce, the silent, exploited majority, who traded the outside world for a life of brutal, relentless physical servitude to fuel the engine of the monastic empire. They were the hands that made the wool wealth real. They sheared the thousands of sheep, managed the vast granges, sometimes miles away from the central abbey, cleaned the sprawling, stinking enclosures, and transported the heavy bales across treacherous, bandit-ridden roads, all while being afforded fewer privileges than a prized hunting dog. Their vow of stability meant they were chained to the land, working punishing 18-hour days under a chilling silence enforced not by piety, but by sheer bone-deep exhaustion and the immediate, terrifying threat of the discipline, the monastic whipping used to enforce obedience. They were expendable tools in a divine business plan. The administration of this ruthless shadow kingdom was handled by men who were masters of ledger books and legal intimidation, not theology. Chief among these financial titans was the cellarer, the monastery's designated CEO and chief operating officer. This man held the keys to the entire treasury, managing the vast estates, negotiating the price of grain futures, and deciding precisely which merchant house in Genoa or Florence got the next massive shipment of premium Cotswold wool. He was the ultimate fixer, a man constantly moving. The rules of Saint Benedict strictly forbade excessive travel and contact with the secular world. Yet the cellarer's horse was rarely stabled for long. He was always riding out under the guise of holy necessity to secure more land, settle a lawsuit against a rival bishop, or intimidate a tenant farmer who dared question the abbey's demands. And the land, oh, the land. Monasteries didn't just passively receive spiritual gifts. They aggressively acquired territory through a complex maze of legal loopholes, outright purchases, and the sheer, crushing weight of their political influence. When a local baron fell into ruinous debt, perhaps from a failed crusade or a devastating marriage dowry, who was the first, most pious creditor knocking on his crumbling castle door? The abbot, of course, offering a Christian solution that always resulted in the immediate transfer of prime agricultural acreage to the church's forever-growing, tax-exempt portfolio. This ruthless land grab didn't stop at mere farms and manors. It extended right into the spiritual heart of the community. Monasteries frequently engaged in the act of appropriation, swallowing up local parish churches and violently redirecting the tithes, money meant to support the local priest and feed the village poor, directly into the central monastic vault. The local peasant, scratching a meager living from the stubborn soil, was now compelled to pay his mandatory tenth to an absentee landlord living in luxury miles away, while his own village church crumbled into disrepair, and the priest starved. The vow of poverty wasn't just broken by the monks, it was fundamentally weaponized against the very people they claimed to be saving. Their supposed isolation was the greatest joke of the age. They were the most globally connected entities in all of Europe, trading futures in distant markets, negotiating complex currency swaps, and leveraging debt like modern oligarchs with absolute impunity. They wore rough, undyed habits to symbolize humility, but they walked on floors literally paved with the gold of nations. This was the terrifying hidden truth of the 13th century. The holiest institutions in the land were actually massive, unregulated hedge funds, cloaked in robes of pious silence, ready to dictate the fate of every soul in England, rich or poor, by the sheer, devastating weight of their accumulated unholy wealth. And their next, most audacious move, already being secretly plotted in the dark hours after Compline, would strike not at the economy, but straight into the very heart of the royal lineage and the king's desperate need for a war chest. The silence that descended upon the cloister after Compline was not the peace of God. It was the suffocating weight of conspiracy, a palpable malice hidden beneath the sacred rituals. Deep within the fortified stone heart of Fountains Abbey, Abbot Theodoric, a man whose simple Cistercian habit belied the calculating, ruthless mind of a true financial titan, watched the flickering candle wax melt, mirroring the slow erosion of the king's temporal authority. This was the moment of maximum danger, the juncture where holy vow met absolute secular greed, and Theodoric intended to maximize the dividends of devotion. The king, Edward, desperate for coin to fund his bloody, exhausting campaigns across the Channel, a war that demanded gold as relentlessly as the grave demands bodies, had made a catastrophic error. He had sought emergency loans, massive, ruinous sums, not from the customary Jewish financiers or Lombard bankers, whom he could tax, expel, or seize from on a royal whim, but from the very men who swore obedience to God, yet answered to no crown but Rome, the great abbots themselves. The vast rolling estates of the Cistercian order were not just fields for pious contemplation. They were the engine room of the English economy, the undisputed, highly efficient masters of the crucial wool staple. Every fleece, every bale, every highly lucrative transaction across the North Sea, from the Humber ports to the bustling markets of Flanders, was tracked, managed, and ultimately controlled by these cloistered administrators, turning spiritual dedication into hard, fungible currency. Edward needed ships, men, and siege engines immediately. The Channel fleet was dangerously exposed. The abbots held the purse strings, the literal keys to the realm's immediate future. They had agreed to the loan, a sum so astronomical it could choke a lesser kingdom. But the collateral demanded was not land nor jewels, but something far more insidious, something that sliced directly into the sovereignty of the crown itself. Their terms demanded absolute, unfettered exemption from royal taxation on all future wool exports, a perpetual hemorrhage of royal revenue, and, worse yet, a binding contractual say in the appointment of the next royal treasurer, the man who controlled the actual inflow and outflow of all state funds. The audacity of the demand was breathtaking, a silent, bloodless coup disguised as an ecclesiastical lending agreement. Theodoric understood with chilling clarity that financial control was the true scepter of power, the ultimate leverage point, and he was ready to wield it, ensuring the immense wealth generated from their pious labor remained safely secured within the Church's iron, unbreachable grasp, eternally beyond the reach of the grasping secular claw. Edward raged in the halls of Westminster, smashing porcelain and cursing the insolence of the supposedly humble men of God. His most trusted advisers pleaded caution. The military disaster overseas was only salvageable if the monastic gold flowed immediately, before the spring thaw allowed the enemy to move. But to grant the abbots the right to influence the exchequer, that was to invite a spiritual enemy directly into the most critical nexus of government, planting a deep root of parallel authority. Yet the political clock was ticking down rapidly to 0 hour. The Scottish frontier was dangerously restless, requiring immediate funds for garrison reinforcement, and the French Navy was already mobilizing its invasion barges across the water. The choice was horrifyingly stark: abdication of economic sovereignty, or total, humiliating military and state collapse. Theodoric, sitting hundreds of miles away behind his thick stone walls, merely smiled in the candlelight. He had leveraged not just his own abbey's fortune, but had secretly coordinated the demands with 3 other massive monastic houses, the ancient, wealthy powerhouses of Glastonbury, St. Albans, and Westminster itself, to create an interlocking chain of debt. If the king defaulted on the demands of one, the entire fragile edifice of royal credit would instantly crash down, making the exchequer immediately bankrupt and the realm utterly ungovernable. The message confirming the collective resolve had to be delivered immediately, before the king's resolve hardened and he chose punitive action. Not through standard official channels, which were riddled with royal spies and suspicious officials, but by a hidden, clandestine network of lay brothers, men who traveled the treacherous roads, ostensibly collecting tithes and managing sheep transfers, but who were in reality the silent, anonymous messengers of this shadow governance, immune to questioning due to their low status. Brother Simon, a squat, uncommunicative man whose face was perpetually hidden beneath a heavy cowl and whose true loyalty was known only to Theodoric, was given the dispatch. It contained only 2 words: accept terms, but it was sealed with the ring of Saint Bernard, an ancient artifact that represented immense, terrifying ecclesiastical authority, demanding immediate obedience. Simon's journey south was a desperate, harrowing race against the executioner's axe. Discovery meant instant charges of high treason and immediate, brutal torture, regardless of his holy habit or monastic vows. The king's men, desperate to intercept any communication that might reveal the full extent of the financial blackmail, had patrols scouring every major road connecting the northern counties to London, checking every traveler. The stakes for the church were impossibly high. If Simon failed, Theodoric's complex web of debt leverage would instantly unravel, and the abbot himself faced not just ecclesiastical censure from Rome, but potential seizure of all monastic assets by the crown under the convenient pretense of disloyalty, a move that would cripple the church's financial power for a generation, potentially the economic foundation of the entire religious infrastructure. Simon moved like a ghost through the muddy lanes near Northampton, traversing the dangerous, bandit-ridden borderlands. The precious, devastating document sewn carefully into the lining of his cheap woolen cloak. He felt the cold, hard pressure of the king's desperation behind him, driving the royal patrols, and the terrifying, relentless ambition of the abbots, compelling him forward. The final secret transfer point was set. A small, forgotten, dilapidated chapel near the deep edge of Sherwood Forest. A place of historical neutrality, where the king's desperate, weary chancellor would meet him under the cloak of deepest pre-dawn night. The chancellor, Lord Beaumont, already felt the poison of the decision consuming his soul, knowing that signing those terms meant forever shifting the balance of power in England, granting away sovereignty, piece by piece. It would be the official, documented moment the spiritual realm formally seized the economic reins of the secular state, placing the crown in permanent, crippling debt. The power of the cross, backed by mountains of Cistercian wool and Lombard gold, was about to bring the mightiest king in Christendom to his knees. The parchment, once signed in the damp, secret darkness of the forgotten chapel, would forever redefine the relationship between throne and altar, creating a financial stranglehold that only the consuming fires of the Reformation, centuries later, could ever hope to break. The greatest financial stranglehold in the history of the realm was not forged in a king's treasury, but in the desolate, wind-swept pastures of the north. It was maintained not by prayer alone, but by a creature of profound economic power, the sheep, millions of them. The pious vow of manual labor, embraced by the most austere monastic orders, had inadvertently spawned the most profitable industrial machine the Middle Ages had ever seen. These silent, remote monasteries, particularly those governed by the fiercely disciplined Cistercian rule, were not retreats of quiet contemplation. They were colossal, vertically integrated agricultural and financial factories. England's wealth, the golden fleece that was the island's most precious export, flowed directly into the secretive international accounting books kept by the white monks themselves. They were the Cistercians, sworn to the strictest interpretations of Saint Benedict's rule, dedicated to isolation and self-sufficiency, yet their isolated houses quickly became the singular epicenter of England's gross domestic product. They transformed the humble pastoral ideal into a ruthless, industrialized powerhouse. Imagine a multi-billion-dollar corporation disguised as a silent retreat center. That chilling paradox was the reality of Fountains Abbey. That was the devastating economic engine of Reavoke. Their sheer scale was staggering and deliberately hidden from common view. The Cistercians owned massive swathes of upland pastures and moorland, terrain often deemed useless by powerful feudal barons, yet perfectly suited for breeding the hardy sheep whose fleece fetched the highest prices in the booming textile centers of Europe. These flocks numbered in the tens of thousands, sometimes eclipsing 250,000, generating mountains of raw material that fueled international markets. The secret to this astonishing, scalable productivity lay in a sophisticated organizational structure that brilliantly skirted the monks' own vows of cloistered existence. They invented and perfected the grange system, massive, remote, industrialized farms run not by the choir monks, those dedicated to the divine office, but by an often forgotten workforce known as the conversi, or the lay brothers. These conversi were essentially non-ordained laborers, often recruited from the peasantry, who took simple, less rigorous vows and managed the back-breaking, essential work of shearing, cleaning, packaging, and transporting the colossal quantities of wool. The choir monks maintained the sacred illusion of spiritual focus and scholarly dedication inside the cloister, while the lay brothers managed the sprawling, ruthless business outside the sacred walls. It was a model of flawless exploitation, immense pious profit without spiritual contamination. The cloistered monk, dedicated solely to prayer and study, never had to get his hands dirty, yet he was the ultimate beneficiary of the colossal, tax-free wealth generated by the invisible army of the conversi and their millions of sheep. The wool itself was meticulously graded, classified, and baled, destined not for the local village markets, but for the unforgiving, cutthroat international stage. Annual contracts were painstakingly negotiated with the powerful merchant houses of Florence, Siena, and the rich, hungry textile centers of Flanders. These were not simple cash transactions. They were complex, future-proofed financial instruments. The monasteries frequently sold their entire wool clip, often 5 years' worth of future production, in advance, receiving astronomical upfront payments in silver and gold coin. They operated expertly on massive leverage and credit, functionally becoming the medieval equivalent of specialized commodity investment bankers, mastering the art of futures trading centuries before the term was invented. When a local baron, or even the king himself, needed immediate, vast amounts of cash for an expensive military campaign or the costly construction of a new castle, where did they inevitably turn? Not to the precarious Jewish financiers, who were constantly targets of royal seizure and persecution, but to the stable, seemingly eternal, and utterly protected wealth locked within the monastic vaults. The Cistercians lent money, but always secured by ironclad, brutally enforced documents and guaranteed by the most valuable asset, land. If the debtor defaulted on the punishing terms, the monastery quietly and inexorably absorbed the property. This was the silent, devastating mechanism of land accumulation that saw the monastic estates swell relentlessly, swallowing up smaller fiefdoms, one defaulted loan, and one strategic acquisition at a time. This was not the work of charity or piety. It was cold, calculating corporate acquisition, cloaked in the ultimate sanctity of the church. By the peak of the 14th century, the great monasteries were not just significant landowners. They had collectively become the single largest, most concentrated landowner in England, controlling perhaps a quarter of the kingdom's entire taxable wealth and productivity. Their massive treasuries were full. Their international accounting books were kept with astounding professional precision, a breathtaking administrative feat for the era. And their influence spanned from the desolate sheep pasture to the highest reaches of the papal curia, and back down to the bargaining tables of the London Wool Exchange and the Royal Exchequer. They dictated commodity market prices. They held massive sway over royal policy regarding taxation and critical trade routes. And they controlled the key to credit that kept the entire economic structure of the island afloat. When the king needed armies, the monasteries supplied the gold necessary to pay the professional mercenaries. The vows of poverty meant that the individual monk owned nothing, which was technically true. But the corporate body of the abbey, the eternal institution, owned absolutely everything. This chilling semantic loophole justified the construction of abbeys that were terrifying architectural statements of immense, barely contained wealth, golden reliquaries reflecting off walls of imported marble and rare stone. This magnificent, enforced silence within the cloister walls was merely the elaborate, spiritual veneer over a churning, high-stakes financial machine that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the moment a king, like the great Plantagenets, dared to challenge this deep-seated, self-perpetuating shadow economy, they discovered the true, unbreakable depth of the monastic stranglehold, forcing them into submission, or worse, into utter and complete financial ruin. The financial empire of the white monks was a ticking time bomb of stored capital, political influence, and deep-seated corruption, guaranteeing that the inevitable reckoning, centuries away, would not be a mere theological squabble over doctrine, but a violent, destructive explosion of power and greed that would utterly reshape the face of Britain forever. The silence within the cloister was a deadly, deceptive thing, the quiet hum of prayer masking the furious, relentless activity of the greatest financial engine in the Western world. While the common folk imagined the monks spent their days illuminated by stained glass, hands clasped in pious meditation, the reality was the frantic, ink-stained labor of 1,000 administrators trying to track an economy that stretched from the freezing sheepwalks of the north to the bustling wool exchanges of Florence and Bruges. This wasn't just a religious house observing the rule of Benedict. It was the Bank of England centuries before the concept existed, a centralized repository of capital so vast it dwarfed the royal treasury itself. Its intricate ledgers, known terrifyingly as the compotus, the final reckoning, were the secret maps to England's true liquid wealth, revealing dependencies and assets the king himself could only guess at. To truly grasp the scope of this shadow governance, one had to move past the lofty, contemplative figure of the abbot and descend into the ranks of the specialized, ruthless administrators who ran the machine with clockwork, terrifying efficiency. They were the hidden CEOs of the Middle Ages, men who had traded the simple life for a life of managing global logistics and massive profit. The Cellaris, a figure often underestimated by outside observers, was in fact the chief logistical and procurement officer, responsible for feeding hundreds of inhabitants daily, managing the vast agricultural output of the domain lands, and ensuring the complex supply chains never faltered. He was a master negotiator, haggling over tons of grain in local markets one moment and commanding the movement of entire flocks of pedigree sheep destined for export the next. His immediate, equally powerful equivalent in internal affairs was the Chamberlain, who oversaw not just the monks' drab woolen habits, but the entire industrial infrastructure required to produce them, from fulling mills powered by diverted rivers to dyers' vats boiling with expensive imported pigments. These were not men of simple faith. They were managers of human capital, material resources, and physical infrastructure, their brains hardwired for inventory control and maximizing output. They utilized a highly sophisticated system of estate management, dividing their vast holdings into isolated, productive units called granges. These granges were run by conversi, lay brothers, or salaried bailiffs who were experts in land use, crop rotation, and most importantly, the brutal business of rent extraction. But the true fortress protecting this astounding accumulation of wealth was not built of stone, no matter how thick the walls. It was constructed of parchment and wax seals, the sacred, unassailable legal framework granted by both the English crown and the distant, yet infinitely more powerful, papacy in Rome. Monasteries possessed royal charters that often placed them utterly beyond the jurisdiction of local sheriffs, feudal lords, and even the king's own tax collectors. They were exempt from tolls, free from most regional feudal obligations, and enjoyed the terrifying privilege of papal immunity, a status that rendered their property untouchable under pain of excommunication. To challenge a monastic land claim, to seize a monastic asset, was not just a legal dispute. It was an act of sacrilege, inviting the full, devastating weight of both earthly royal court censure and eternal spiritual condemnation. The monastic lands were sovereign territories within a sovereignty, pockets of absolute, unassailable power that grew thicker and richer with every passing generation. And when legal disputes did arise, which with that much wealth was a daily occurrence, the monastery did not rely solely on prayer or moral persuasion. They employed formidable, often intimidating lay bailiffs, strong-armed men who managed the distant estates and ensured rent collection was handled with definitive finality. These bailiffs often commanded retinues of armed servants, nominally guards protecting flocks and harvests, but effectively the private security force of the monastic empire, ready to enforce the terms of the charter with polearms if necessary. And finally, the scriptorium, that hallowed hall of silent scribes, was not solely dedicated to illuminating Bibles and recording saintly lives. It was the central registry, the high-speed data center of the medieval world. Here, generation after generation, every single transaction, every land grant, every tenant's obligation, and every receipt for wool sold in Lombardy was meticulously, indelibly recorded in the great cartularies. These records, bound in heavy leather and locked away in the safest, most fireproof vaults, were the undeniable proof of ownership, the eternal title deeds that allowed the monasteries to maintain their grip across centuries. Forget the holy relics and the fragments of saints' bones. The real sacred treasure, the true source of their enduring dominance, was the volume containing the list of their debtors and the legal precedent for seizing property. This administrative mastery, this incredible coordination of logistics, law, finance, and security is what truly defined the monastic Leviathan. They had turned spiritual devotion into the most successful, self-perpetuating, and immune business model the 12th and 13th centuries had ever witnessed. A shadow kingdom that answered only to Rome, or perhaps only to its own overflowing coffers. But a king, any king, can only tolerate a rival, independent sovereignty, operating with impunity impunity and holding such a colossal percentage of the nation's liquid wealth and best productive land for so long. The stage was set not just for theological argument, but for a fundamental, epoch-shattering confrontation over economics and ultimate, indivisible authority. The silence of the cloister was soon to be broken by the ringing sound of steel and the crash of collapsing financial empires.